Why in the world would someone make a video about Overwatch's most boring hero? I'll tell you why, because the history of his horse is a lot more interesting than you first think. People often call Orisa boring, lame, unfun, among a plethora of other things, but how did we get to this point? Orisa has been a meta-defining hero and even received a huge rework upon the launch of Overwatch 2 with plenty of hype, so how have we still ended up here? What is the true history of Overwatch's most boring hero? Orisa was first released in March of 2017, becoming Overwatch's 24th hero at the time. Unlike Sombra, who I covered in my previous video, Orisa wasn't teased for months on end by some elaborate ARG, but was rather simply hyped up by a few well-done hints leading into a launch trailer and origin story. Despite this lack of significant build-up, however, the community was still incredibly excited to finally see a new tank being added to the game, as previously there had only been 5 to choose from. And on paper, Orisa's abilities seemed really cool. First off, she had her fusion driver. For the most part, this gun was pretty similar to the one she has today, acting as a mid-range poke weapon capable of sustained fire with okay damage. The big difference was that this original fusion driver used ammo instead of the overheat mechanic we see today, on top of slowing you whilst shooting. But now's where things get more interesting. Orisa's first ability was known as Halt. This was a big green sphere that you could shoot out and then reactivate in order to pull nearby enemies towards its center. This was crazy as it could set up some really cool combos, but we'll get onto that later. Next up was her Fortify, which is the only ability she still has today, and for the most part, the current one remains relatively similar to its original incarnation. However, the old version was slightly less suppressive as it gave no overhealth and was only effective on Orisa's 400 hit points as opposed to her current 625. This was counteracted though by her final ability, Protective Barrier, which as the name states was just straight up a big shield you could place down in front of you. Finally, her ultimate was Supercharger, aka the Bongo, which gave your entire team 50% increased damage within a certain area. As I said, people were actually really excited to give this new character a try. But at this point, you may be beginning to wonder how Orisa is supposed to be Overwatch's most boring hero if she was met with such joy upon release. And to that I say, a lot can change in 7 years. And it will. But for now, or well, for people in 2017, the horse was gladly welcomed into the Overwatch universe. So, how did Orisa develop following her launch, and when exactly did she become so boring? Well, let's start with that first part. After being released, Orisa didn't receive any major changes. At one point her power was shifted a little more into her core identity as a protector, and later on her shield was made even bigger, but on the whole not much was done to change her. In terms of her pick rates, she sat on the lower side, but that's not surprising considering her slower playstyle. In all fairness, you could already call her more boring than other heroes due to the fact she was a defensive tank with a pretty low damage output, but that's very subjective and wasn't an issue at the time, as she still had a significant core playbase and wasn't too annoying for the enemy to deal with. She was just another tank which played into the more team-oriented nature of what Overwatch was at the time. So when would she truly begin to be labelled as boring? Well, for that, people would have to wait a little longer, until the release of a certain Sombra. For now, Orisa remained fine however, nothing game-breaking, just another Overwatch hero. She may have been a little underpowered as she was pretty irrelevant in high-level play at the time and was barely seen during Season 3 and 4 of Apex, but it's not like she was unplayable. Blizzard did give her that one buff in August, but for the most part, Orisa actually didn't experience much change for a while. As such, let's fast forward a little to the beginning of Overwatch's official competitive scene, OWL, in 2018. To begin with, the meta in the Overwatch League remained similar to that of Apex, focusing on fast dive comps which involved using high mobility to quickly engage onto isolated targets. Of course, Orisa did not fit into this system. However, she was still relevant, being the third most played tank during the league's inaugural season, and picking up the core of a defensive poke comp. Here, she was often paired with Roadhog due to their huge combo potential, with Orisa's Halt being able to pull the enemy away from cover as they easily get hooked by Hog. The horse wasn't always played alongside Roadhog however, sometimes being a solo tank since Roadhog was yet to be implemented, or being paired with D.Va due to her general strength. Either way, Orisa was most popular as a defensive hero, specifically being used when defending on Assault due to her ability to protect her teammates and shoot from afar. This would continue for the rest of the 2018 season, and despite a few small buffs, her pick rate would remain relatively stable around 11%. That was in competitive play, but how was Orisa faring in regular games? Well, pretty normally. Unlike the insane amount of discourse you see today, at the time she was just another hero, neither loved nor hated. Of course, people's opinions would change eventually, but first they had bigger problems, most notably, Ghosts. Ghost was a meta centered around running 3 tanks and 3 supports, fueled by the OP new hero Burgess. At first, you may think this was good for Orisa, she is a tank after all. However, in this case, not the right one. Instead, Ghost usually consisted of Orion, D.Va, and Zarya, and was more of a close quarters brawl comp as opposed to Orisa's ranged poke. As such, she wasn't played a whole lot, and this includes both regular ranked and AL. Due to the ridiculous power of Brig, Ghost was the best comp for a long time, and so Orisa wasn't really relevant for that same extended period. Even going into 2019, she only saw the occasional pick from pro teams for the first 3 stages of the season, and there are only 4 stages. Since Brigitte was so powerful, even after 1, 2, 3, 6 separate attempts at nerfing her, Ghost was somehow still meta, and so Blizzard decided to take a different approach, introducing Role Lock in August of 2019. People will have their different opinions on Role Lock, but one thing I can say is that it was great for a horse friend. Ghost was finally dead since it was physically no longer possible, and Orisa seized the opportunity to enter the spotlight. She had previously gotten a series of small buffs which had gone under the radar, but now that people were scrambling for new ideas, I realized just how strong Orisa had become. By the way, this video took a lot of time to make, and in the future I'll be covering other heroes such as Widow, Brig, or Ryan, so if you want to see more, I'd love it if you could like and subscribe in order to not miss future releases. Going into stage 4 of AL 2019, Orisa quickly climbed up to a 70% usage rate, becoming the most popular hero in the entire pro scene. Comboing with either Hog or D.Va, she encouraged a defensive bunker style comp, with heroes such as Hanzo for consistent range damage, as well as Mei for controlling space and isolating solid targets. Easy to say that Orisa was possibly the best hero at the time, with this even flowing over into a high play rate in normal ranked games. At the time, people were mostly fine with this however, as they were glad that Ghost was finally gone and that a new tank could have the spotlight for a while. But Orisa held that spotlight for more than just a while. Enter Sigma.
What is that melody?
Sigma was Overwatch's 31st hero, the second to last one released in Overwatch 1. And let's just say, similarly to Brig, he had a pretty darn strong kit. High range damage, a movable shield, a stun, a one-shot combo, and an additional set of survivability made him incredibly powerful, and coincidentally he synergized particularly well with Orisa. This created probably the second most infamous meta in Overwatch history, Double Shield. It's pretty easy to understand. Basically, Orisa had a shield, Sigma had a shield, together they had 2 shields. Double Shield allowed these heroes to simply cycle their barriers around each other's, meaning that your team pretty much always had one in front of them. And this new meta was not only incredibly powerful, but also incredibly boring. This was when Orisa truly began her descent into darkness. Since both teams always had 2 shields, it became almost impossible to actually do damage, and since doing damage is kind of an important thing, this meta was really slow paced, with fights potentially lasting for several minutes each. This was becoming GOAT all over again, except this time even without the brawl element, which made it bearable for some people. Sigma wasn't released until the latter part of stage 4, but once the Overwatch League playoffs and grand finals came around, he was everywhere. Among the 8 teams present in this stage of the competition, only one played anything but Sigma Orisa, with Fury for the London Spitfire being the minor exception to the rule. Following this release, Double Shield wasn't immediately adapted into regular games, but soon enough it would find its way there as well, and all of a sudden Blizzard were scrambling to nerf its US shields into a reasonable state. Thankfully, their attempts would work to an extent, as Double Shield slowly became less of a problem, albeit slowly. But how big of a difference would this really make? I mean, lower ranks might get off the hook, but would the pro scene receive the same blessing? Well, with the beginning of AL Season 3 in 2020, viewers were hoping that the meta might have changed for the better, and with the opening game of the season, their prayers would be answered. Only one Orisa and no Sigmas were present in that first game. Blizzard's long series of nerfs had paid off. A little disappointingly, Double Shield was still seen a lot, with Orisa and Sigma still having the highest overall pick rates in the tank category for most of the season. But at least now there was some variety, and that's always a good thing. Despite the scales beginning to balance out, people were still beginning to get seriously tired of seeing any variation of Orisa comps, considering just how long she'd been good for at this point. And so, Blizzard put in one last set of changes to finally rid the game of double shield in August of 2020. Although this was necessary, it resulted in Orisa falling off a cliff and becoming practically unplayable for a short while. Somewhat surprisingly, a lot of people were actually annoyed at this change. This wasn't because they didn't think Orisa needed some sort of nerf, rather due to this change removing a lot of power from Halt specifically, which was probably the most fun part of her entire kit. Orisa proceeded to see no more balance adjustments for a good while, and although she was in one of her most boring states of play of all time, people eventually came to accept it. Eventually, she would receive one major change, being that Fortify now prevented headshot damage, but of course for a casual this wasn't the most exciting buff. And although it did make her better, once ALPH Season 4 began, Orisa was barely played. Soon after, Blizzard did reduce the cooldown on ult however, meaning that Orisa could reclaim her ult spot as second favorite main tank, and be placed in a more acceptable position overall. This then remained the same for the rest of 2021, staying as the second or third best main tank in the Overwatch League, but never being able to defeat the immense power of dive and coordinated play. That was in the Overwatch League, but how did she fare for normal plays in 2021? Well, thanks to the aforementioned buffs, she was also relatively powerful in regular games, yet barely saw any play. At this point, many casual fans had become tired of her slow gameplay and kit, which simply didn't feel impactful enough. Combine that with her general negative perception following Double Shield's dominance, and Orisa was left with only a very small core group of players. This is where she stayed for the rest of Overwatch 1. She no longer felt good to play or fun to play against like she had a few years prior. As such, Blizzard realized that something had to change. Little did they know that they would only make things worse. Next up, Overwatch 2. With the general mentality that barriers were a bad thing, combined with Orisa's recent complaints on top of the impending solo tank environment, the balance team decided to completely rework her kit. First off, a change to her weapon. Fusion Driver would now use an overheat mechanic instead of ammo, as well as having some significant damage falloff, thereby displaying how Blizzard wanted to shift Orisa into more of a close-range combatant. Next, replacing Halt was a new ability, Energy Javelin, aka a big spear you could throw at your enemies. After that, another ability was added, this time replacing Orisa's barrier. Javelin Spin would instead be a mini defense matrix, also capable of doing damage and giving you a bit of temporary movement speed. On top of that, Fortify would be changed to give some extra overhealth, but slow Orisa whilst active, otherwise staying pretty similar to its previous iteration. Finally, a new ultimate known as Terror Surge would allow the horse to pull in nearby enemies and then slam down for big damage. So, finally Orisa had been saved, right? How did she do in this new state? Well, let's have a look at Overwatch League Season 5, which played on an early build of Overwatch 2 in order to find out. Drumroll please, Orisa was absolutely god awful, seeing a flat 0% pick rate for the first half of the season. This new form she had transitioned into was way too weak. I mean, first off, her ult was just inexplicably bad, going from Bongo being a top tier ability to Terror Surge being undoubtedly the worst ultimate in the entire game. At least not every part of her kit was trash, with Javelin actually being pretty good, but overall Orisa's original Overwatch 2 state was rough. Luckily though, since the game was still in beta, Blizzard had time to fix this before the official release, and they did grant her a series of buffs. As such, Orisa was at least playable by the end of the ALPH season. Now, this is all fine and dandy, but what really matters is how Orisa performed for the casual player. With the eventual launch of Overwatch 2, one final buff on release day meant that she wasn't too bad, putting her in a good spot balance-wise, ready for the influx of new players. And overall, this rework was met with relative positivity. Although Orisa mains were a little disappointed with how their entire hero was changed, on the whole, the Overwatch community was glad that she had been altered into a more active and engaging hero, a more fun hero. Even Flat shared this opinion at the time, and to begin with, it was true, Orisa was no longer boring. A rework was a success. But for how long? We all know how people see Orisa today, and she hasn't been changed massively since this rework, so when exactly did people's opinions begin to shift? Well, let me tell you, it did not take long. More specifically, 2 days. Yes, 2 days is all it took before people started to hate Orisa again. That's because there was a fundamental problem with her new design, being that she was now built to bully the enemy. Unlike the passive Orisa of old, the new and improved horse could just run into you and prevent you from playing the game, whilst also not dying. To be fair, this problem was kind of shared among all tanks at the time, as everyone had been buffed up in order to be alone on the front line, but Orisa, let's say, took advantage of this more than others. Now, this doesn't mean that the previous part about Orisa being fun was a lie. She was fun to play, especially since she felt so fresh and aggressive compared to Overwatch 1. But she was not fun to play against, and as we know, things would only get worse from here. For the next couple of months, there continued to be some complaints about Orisa, but overall people weren't getting too annoyed, as she was in a pretty balanced state. That would begin to change, however, going into Season 2, with her ult finally becoming somewhat usable, and her gun being better in mid-range. Combine this with Roadhog being meta, someone who Orisa is a good counter to, and she moved up to being one of the top tanks. Even though Hog is famously hated by the community, this is when people truly began complaining about Orisa, calling her more annoying than Hog when he still had his one-shots. Now, Orisa's problem had shifted. She went from being pretty boring to play but relatively fine to play against, to being pretty fun to play yet super boring to verse. Luckily, this frustration would be temporarily quelled by a couple of nerfs, making her less oppressive, but she was still somewhat annoying even then, especially for casuals. At least top tier players were off the hook though, with Orisa being practically non-existent for the entirety of our Season 6, since she was easier to either take out or ignore with proper coordination. The only time she was really put into play was by Smurf on the Boston Uprising, specifically to counter London Spitfire's Rhine comp. However, the Overwatch League makes up such a tiny part of the total player base that Orisa not being dominant there didn't really matter. What mattered is how she was perceived by the casual, and things in that regard were about to get even worse. That's because Blizzard made the mistake of slowly micro-buffing Orisa over a long span, thereby gradually increasing her power until she was suddenly unbelievably oppressive. This all culminated in August of 2023 when she received another increase to her survivability. And now more than ever, people felt that she just never died. No matter how much you shot her, she couldn't be taken out. The problem was that the main counter to Orisa was to just ignore her, but the majority of players either didn't understand or didn't enjoy that, because for a lot of people shooting the tank is fun, but when you keep shooting and they never die, that isn't fun. Now, I could sit here for another 5 minutes and keep talking about how Orisa kept getting small nerfs and then small buffs on repeat, and how people kept complaining again and again, but that feels like a waste of time. Instead, let's fast forward to the present, where Orisa has just received 3 small buffs in a row. On the whole, people aren't complaining about Orisa as much anymore, though I suspect that is simply due to her not currently being meta, as well as people now having other things to complain about, such as 5v5. However, she is still generally seen as lame and boring, and people do still get annoyed the few times they encounter her. So, to encapsulate her history, she went from fun on release to being boring to play, and double shield being frustrating, to then getting reworked and again being fun, but becoming miserable to play against and somewhat boring to play over time. Throughout this video, I've attempted to give an unbiased history of this hero, mostly just bringing up facts and outside opinions. But now I'd like to quickly lift why I think people find Orisa to be so boring. In my opinion, there are 2 main issues with her currently. First off, she can be a bit of a skill check hero for casuals who focus too hard on her instead of the rest of her team. Although in general, even if you do target her backline, a hero who just sits there without dying but also without really contributing to the fights is neither fun for you nor the Orisa themselves. The second issue is counter swapping. Orisa is not a hero who a huge number of players start a game on, however she is someone that a lot of tank players switch to the second they see a bad matchup. This is fair enough, as playing a bad matchup is not fun, and Orisa is an easy way to avoid that. Then again, this then makes the game unfun for the other tank who now gets bullied by an Orisa, and it's even worse since they feel like you specifically picked Orisa to counter them. This is more of a fundamental Overwatch 2 issue, but it ends up impacting Orisa in particular in a really negative way. I don't really know how this is supposed to be fixed without going back to 2 tanks to be honest, but I don't want to get into that debate. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this comprehensive history of Orisa. I'd love to hear what you think about her past and current states. Also, let me know what hero I should cover next. I'll see you next time.